Describe the process of writing. Can I? No. I think because it's very, very different dependent on the genre that you're writing. I used to write only short stories, but now I've done I've written a couple of scripts for TV. I've done a film script, some poetry, and at the moment I'm writing a novel. And the process for each of them is very, very different. I certainly don't subscribe to the kind of plan, draft, redraft approach that I know as a school teacher. I know it's very, very prevalent in schools. That's the structure that children are encouraged to do. And it's good because it does give people a structure. But I think writing is much more organic than that, and I think there has to be the recognition that people work in different ways. Certainly, if that plan, draft, redraft process works for people, they should stick to it. But I'm not a very good planner in most of my writing. And as for redrafting, Philip Pullman once said a lovely quote that really rang bells with me. He once said that he never wrote drafts. He only wrote finished drafts of work. And what he said was, I might write 12 finished drafts of the same piece, but I never approach it from the point of view of doing something that is unfinished. And I think that's very, very true. As a writer, when you put in your final full stop, you want it to be finished, and you want to give it to people, and you want people to say, that's marvellous, that's the best thing that's ever been written. Of course, that never happens. But I think the process, I've never enjoyed the process of giving people something that is half finished. I like talking through ideas with people and then going away with working on it. But the idea that I would write a story knowing I then had to completely redraft it just turns me off completely. Having said that, I think, for example, I'm trying to write a novel. The problem with that is that requires a great deal of planning. That requires a great deal of foresight and knitting things together. And that's quite difficult for me. Or a few years ago, I wrote an adaptation of a short story that I'd written called The Practicality of Magnolia, which was filmed. And the process of converting a short story into a film, into a script, was really unusual, because you had to do away with all the writerly things, all the description and all the metaphors and all of that, and you had to rely absolutely completely on action and dialogue. And so the process was very, very different for that. And when I went on to write a feature film script called The Island, what I found there was that the planning needed in terms of working out key scenes and working out character profiles and plot treatments was an enormous process. It took about 6 months before I could actually sit down and write the script. I think, though, for any writer, the key part of the process is conferencing, presenting your work to other people and talking to people about your work, whether it's finished or not. Talking to people about your work. I really kick-started as a writer when I went along to a writers group and began putting things in front of people, putting stories in front of people and saying, what do you think about that? And what that forces you to do is it forces you to think about what you've written. It forces you to look at alternative possibilities, and it forces you either to accept them or to defend your original decision. And I think the thought process you go through when you attend a writer's workshop it is absolutely vital to the writing process. So what I would say to anyone who wants to be a writer is find yourself a good writer's workshop that will criticise quite forcefully but constructively the work that you do, and be prepared to defend it, but also be prepared to adapt. I probably hit writer's block a lot more than I should. It is a big problem. I find that I work much, much better when I'm away from my normal environment. I don't work particularly productively at home because I always find some diversionary tactic, whether it's putting on a washing or doing the dishes or feeding the cats or whatever. I always find a diversion. So for me, it's about getting out of my normal environment, even if it's going down to the local library, to sit in the local library for 3 hours to write, or even to look over notes and begin to put that together. That's much more productive. I remember a few years ago I spent a couple of months in France on a writing residency. It was only 8 weeks, but in that 8 weeks I managed to write 30,000 words of a novel, plus a couple of short stories and a couple of poems, which was extremely productive. As soon as I came back home, and I work full time, so coming back home to my work, it just completely blocked. And that's a big problem, particularly for young writers, writers who are in the upper stages of secondary school. They've got so many demands on them. They might have 5 or 6 subjects to study. They've got all of these demands on studying and on coursework, and it's incredibly difficult to maintain that focus. But you absolutely have to. I'm actually finding that relaxation and hypnotherapy work quite well. Now that's a very specialised area, but certainly what I would say to any writer who's struggling with their work is to find time to relax, find time to empty your head. Be prepared to walk away from your writing for a while, to give yourself time to think. And also be aware that sometimes the problem might not be with you, it might be with what you're writing, that what you're writing just isn't inspiring you to go anywhere. So be fairly ruthless about what you're writing and saying to yourself, is this really going somewhere? Can I make something of this? It may well be that you can't.